Hey there, my name is Alex, I am the Silver Mont, and this is a starter guide for Monster Hunter World, in which I'll be covering some of the gameplay mechanics and factors that will be helpful for new players to understand. Of course, if you have any questions that aren't covered in the video, ask them below and I'll get back to you ASAP. I won't be covering weapons in this video, as I'll touch on those individually in another video later on. This will cover broader aspects of the game. Follow the timecodes on screen if you want to see a specific subject. That out of the way, let's get started. Understanding stats is probably the best place to begin. Unlike other games, you do not level up and allocate stats in Monster Hunter directly. Instead, your stats will change based on what armor and weapons you have equipped. Let's start with health. The maximum amount of health or hit points you can currently have is 200. By default, your hunter will have 100 health. Eating a meal can increase that temporarily to 150. And if you have a level 3 health boost, you'll reach the maximum of 200. Keep in mind that the single best way of improving your defense in Monster Hunter is increasing your health, so that should be a priority when it comes to defense. Next up we have the actual defense stat. This comes from your equipped armor. Sometimes weapons can provide a defense boost too. Armour can be upgraded using armour spheres and money, with each level providing more defense. There are two caps to this defense. The first cap will be reached just by upgrading with armour spheres. Once you've reached this limit, you can augment the weapon to remove the upgrade limit. This will effectively allow you to upgrade the armour again, further increasing the defense. Finally, your third form of defensive stat would be elemental resistances. Most pieces of armor will either increase or decrease your elemental resistance to a certain element. Example, you might end up having plus 10 fire resistance but minus 10 ice resistance. Having plus 20 resistance to an element will mean you are immune to that specific element's status effect or blight, which we'll cover shortly. In the same way, every monster will have elemental weaknesses and resistances. Rathalos, for example, has 3-star weakness to dragon but is resistant to fire. Typically, it isn't worth it to ever include defense up skills in your build, but you may want to consider elemental resistances for certain fights. For example, are you making an armor set that you plan to use against enemies that use thunder? Then you may want to have 20 thunder resistance, and so on. Then we have stamina. This is the bar below your health bar that is depleted by various actions, such as sprinting, climbing, and certain attacks. Much like health, stamina has a maximum cap. By default you have 100 stamina, and this will deplete by a chunk of 25 every 15 minutes during a hunt. You can replenish this back to maximum by eating rations, meat, or meals. There are various skills that affect your stamina, such as the total cap, the amount it drains, and so on. Note that not every attack drains stamina, and some weapons will use it very differently to others. The main important thing with stamina is never reach 0, because then you will become winded, which is not a good thing as you'll be defenseless for several seconds. Now let's cover the offensive stats. Your attacks in Monster Hunter are split between raw, purely physical damage, and elemental damage. The exact formulas can be found online, and I won't cover them in this video as, well, this is a starter guide. I'll stick to more basic explanations. But essentially, all of your attacks in Monster Hunter are modified by 3 substats: sharpness, motion values, and affinity. Let's say your weapon has 1000 attack rating. Your first modifier to this will be your sharpness. This is the bar on screen that determines how sharp your weapon is. Yes, even a hammer. Running from red, the least sharp, through orange, yellow, green, blue, white, and purple, currently the highest level of sharpness. If you are starting the game out, you'll notice most of your weapons are yellow or green and the sharpness depletes very rapidly. Don't worry, as you progress through the game and make stronger weapons, you'll find they start to have more and more sharpness. Sharpness primarily influences 2 things: a modifier for your attack, and your bounce resistance. Did you hit a monster and your weapon just bounced right off? That's a sign that the monster part you hit is hard, for starters, and also that your weapon may not be sharp enough. Now, different parts of the monster will be harder than others, of course. But the sharper your weapon, the larger the modifier will be to your damage, as demonstrated here. What you want to take away from this is that your weapon should always be yellow or above. Don't let it fall to orange. By default, sharpening takes a while, so you're going to want to use it out of combat in most situations. Different attacks will drain sharpness at different rates, you'll also find out. Using the gun lance's shelling, for example, will drastically decrease sharpness. which you then may want to take into account when choosing your armor skills. Next up we have motion values, or MVs. This is the individual modifier for every attack on every weapon. Let's look at an example greatsword with 1000 attack rating. That doesn't mean every attack will do 1000 damage. What it means is that every different move with the weapon's motion value will scale based on that 1000 attack rating. For example, if I use the kick attack, which has a motion value of 5, you'll notice it does a lot less damage than the overhead slash, which has an MV of 48. Whilst these motion values aren't really accessible in the game, you can test it out yourself by going to the training area and just finding what is the highest damage attack your weapon of choice has. And I'll cover those a bit more in the weapon video too. Finally we have affinity. You could think of this as just critical hit chance, or crit chance, from other RPGs. Let's say you have 50% affinity. That means you have a 50% chance to crit, and a critical hit will deal 25% bonus damage. Whereas if you had minus 50% affinity, you'll have a 50% chance to do 25% less damage. So yes, you can critically fail, you could say. So it goes without saying, affinity is a stat you generally want as high as possible. At time of writing, it is one of the most important offensive stats in the game, if not the most important. But we also have elemental damage alongside our physical damage, right? This is combined and rolled into your damage formula. But again, at time of writing, elemental is generally weaker than physical damage in Monster Hunter World. Some weapons will benefit more from it than others though. One reason for this is affinity. Your crit chance only affects your physical damage, unless you have certain skills active that make it work for element 2. That about covers it for stats though, so let's move on. Strictly speaking, in Monster Hunter we have status effects, blights, and ailments. Status effects are what you might think of as buffs. Eating a meal or having a hunting horn toot at you will generally provide these. Things like more health, more stamina, elemental resistances, and so on. I won't go into great detail on these as they are largely self-explanatory, like more health, but the status effect feline insurance is one you're going to want to look out for. More on that in the hub section. But for now, let's move on to blights. Fire Blight is akin to burning and will gradually lower your health. If you're fighting a fire using enemy and it does a fire attack on you, there's a chance you will get Fire Blight, same for all the others. You can remove Fire Blight by rolling several times or using a Nullberry. Water Blight will slow down your stamina recovery and can be removed with a Nullberry. Thunder Blight lowers your resistance to being stunned. If you have the Thunder Blight, there's a much higher chance you'll be stunned, in essence. You can remove it with Nullberries. Ice Blight increases your stamina usage, and can be removed with a Nullberry. Finally, we have Dragon Blight, which lowers your weapon's elemental and status potency, and can be removed with a Nullberry. Next up we have the status ailments themselves. Poison acts like Fire Blight in some ways, in that it slowly reduces your health, but you can't roll to remove it. Antidotes and the like will remove it. Stun will, as it suggests, stun your character and leave them unable to move for several seconds. Friendly hunters can knock you out of stun, and supposedly waggling the analog stick will reduce the time it is active. But I feel like that either doesn't work or has a very small effect, as I never really notice it myself. Then we have paralysis, which works similar to stun. You're left unable to move for some time. Friendly hunters can knock you out of paralysis by launching you into the air. Then we have sleep, which causes you to sleep until you're hit by an enemy or wake up. During the drowsy state, when you're about to fall asleep, you can drink an energy drink to wake up, or you can be hit launched by another player. Blast Blight will cause you to explode after a certain amount of time or being hit. You can remove it by rolling several times or a Nullberry. Bleeding causes you to take damage anytime you perform an action. It can be removed by crouching for a certain amount of time or by eating meat. Finally, there's Effluvia. This will cut your maximum health by a significant amount. It is cured by using a Nullberry. And whilst it's not a status effect as such, it's the only real place I could think to mention it, monsters will roar quite often in Monster Hunter. For example, when they are about to become enraged, they will roar. This roar will cause your character to be staggered for several moments. You can roll through a roar to evade it, you can block it, or you can take the skill earplugs to negate it entirely. As for being enraged, you could think of this as a status effect for monsters. During certain points in the fight, they will become enraged, at which point their icon will turn from yellow to red on the map. During this state, they will be more aggressive and you cannot use a flint shot on them. However, you can force a monster to become enraged by using flint shot on it in the first place. And why would you want to make a monster enraged? Well, perhaps you have Agitator on your armor set. You will also notice that several monsters can do other sorts of disables or stuns, knockout style things to you. For example, they can use tremors to make the ground quake beneath you, they can use air pressure to knock you over, all sorts of wonderful things. Now of course, whilst you as the player cannot inflict elemental blights on monsters, you can inflict status ailments. If your weapon is a sleep element weapon, hitting a monster enough will cause them to eventually fall asleep. Same with poison, paralysis and blast. Well, they won't make the monster sleep, but hitting them enough will trigger the corresponding effect. At time of writing, blast and poison are usually the most effective and powerful weapons, as they just flat out add more damage and are effective against many different monsters. Think of it as an invisible meter. Every time you hit a monster, you build up that meter. Once it fills up, the monster will be poisoned, causing it to tick for some damage until the effect expires. Whereas once you fill the blast meter, the monster will just explode for a burst of immediate damage. Poison can be especially effective on certain monsters such as Safi'jiiva, where it will tick for something like 100 damage every tick. Causing a monster to sleep means it will wake up after you hit it once, but that one attack will have a very large attack modifier, so get that greatsword ready. Another alternative for wake up attacks is to use a flint shot to launch it into a nearby wall, if there happens to be one. You can even put bombs by the wall so the monster will run into the wall and explode the bombs. Stunning is a little different. You don't specifically get stun weapons, but you can still stun monsters by inflicting blunt damage to the monster's head. We didn't really talk about damage types, but all physical damage is split between cutting and blunt damage. Cutting is obviously good for chopping off tails. Blunt damage is good for stunning when used on the head. Every monster part will have certain resistances to blunt or cutting, so you'll have to experiment and see which parts are best for your type of weapon. You can of course review all of this information in the Hunter's Log, and lots of other useful things, so keep an eye out and remember to check that out. As for stun, you can of course increase its effectiveness via skills. Speaking of, let's talk about those at last. Most weapons and armor in Monster Hunter World come with skills. These are essentially stat modifiers that increase your character's power or defense. For example, the health boost skill will give you plus 15 health if you have 1 level in it, plus 30 with 2 levels, plus 50 with 3 levels. 3 is the maximum number of levels for that particular skill. You don't have to use an entire set of armor, as you may want to mix and match to get the skill combinations that you desire. However, certain sets of armor can have set bonuses. For example, if you have 3 pieces of Teostra's armor set equipped, you will receive Teostra Technique, which is a special set bonus which prevents your weapon from losing sharpness when you crit. You will also notice that most armor sets in the game have an alpha and a beta set. What this effectively means is that alpha sets will have more skills on them but less decoration slots. And what are decoration slots? Well, as the name would infer, you can slot in decorations to these. Decorations are what you might think of as skill gems. So you might find a health boost gem which works the exact same way as an armor skill. If your helmet has health boost level 2 and a decoration slot, you could put in health boost decoration and voila, now you have level 3 health boost. Generally speaking, beta sets are better because they allow you more freedom in your decorations. Of course, you need to have the decorations in question, so you might want to think of the beta sets as more of a long-term investment, whereas alpha sets may fulfill your more immediate needs. There are an incredible number of skills in Monster Hunter, so I won't cover them all, but some of my favourites and what I would consider some of the most effective are Health Boost, Weakness Exploit, Critical Boost, and Critical Eye, along with the aforementioned 3-piece set bonus from Teostra. Health Boost, as you know, increases your total health. Weakness Exploit means that when you attack an enemy's weak spot, that attack has 30% more affinity, in other words 30% more crit chance, 50% if that area is wounded. Whereas Critical Boost just means every crit will deal 140% damage instead of 125% damage. Critical Eye, it just gives you more affinity, more crit chance. All of these skills synergize very nicely. But you can of course experiment and find out what works for you. Keep in mind that some skills will of course work better for some weapons than for others. As mentioned, you can upgrade your armor by leveling it up with armor spheres, increasing its total defense. But you can also augment it with special materials to remove that cap, allowing you to increase its level and defense even further. Weapons can't strictly be leveled up. Instead, you will usually craft a weapon and then you can upgrade it in its weapon tree. Note that not every weapon can be upgraded. Sometimes you'll just forge the final form of a weapon. That's relatively rare though. Weapons can be augmented, although their effects are different to armor augments. Of course, this is endgame stuff, so you won't be augmenting weapons right away. When you do augment a weapon, you can increase its power in certain ways, using rarer materials to add an augmentation to it from the following: more attack, more affinity, more defense, a slot upgrade, which will add a decoration slot, etc., or health regen. In my opinion, health regen is by far the best of the weapon augmentations. You might think, well, if I want to kill the monster as fast as possible, isn't it better to just have even more damage? In a sense, yes, but the amount of damage you can get from augmentations is minuscule. We're talking like a few percent at most. So yes, you could min-max for that, but health augmentation is so nice, because it's basically the only way to get life on hit. And it might still improve your clear times as you won't need to stop attacking, you can just keep on attacking. With the health augment, it means every time you hit a monster, you will heal for a percentage of the damage you deal. It can't be overstated how good this is. It's amazing. Outside of very specific situations, such as say a Sappy Jiva build, you probably wouldn't want health regen there. But aside from situations like that, I think it's always the best one to bet on your weapon. Some weapons can also hold more than one augment. In my opinion, the priority is health regen, affinity, attack increase. But if you're using the greatsword for example, you might want to put attack ahead of affinity. Generally speaking, slower weapons benefit more from the attack power than faster weapons, which benefit more from affinity. Weapons and armor are divided into low rank, high rank, and master rank at time of writing. These days you can start the game with the powerful Guardian armor, which will last you all the way through low and high rank. I mean, it's so strong it will last you right up to master rank. If you're just trying to blast your way through those earlier parts of the game, it will render you almost unkillable. But hey, I'm not going to judge you if you want to use it. Ignoring that, I would suggest that it's not really worth making many low rank armors. Just make one that can carry you through to high rank, then make another at high rank to do the same until master rank. Incidentally, the best high rank armor in my opinion was the Draken set from the Final Fantasy XIV crossover. As for weapons, these upgrade in a more linear manner, so you can make a low rank weapon and then you will upgrade it through high rank and master rank, unlike armors which are completely separate. Low rank armor can't be upgraded into high rank armor, and so on. My advice would be to create either a blast or poison weapon of your chosen weapon category and use that to progress through the game as an all-purpose weapon. Then once you hit master rank and higher content, you can start to create more specialized builds of weapons and armor. Monster Hunter World has a lot of equipment slot loadouts, so you can create a specialized build for every single monster in the game and more if that's your wish. Naturally, while some weapons might work a little better against some monsters than others, every monster can be killed by every weapon type. Finally, we have equipment, mantles, and boosters. These are special items you can obtain throughout the game that will enhance your combat ability. For example, the Fire Mantle will not only reduce the fire damage you receive, but will render you immune to Fire Blight. This allows people like me to forego elemental resistances and rely on mantles and the like. All of these elemental mantles are very useful against monsters with powerful elemental attacks. Eventually, you'll be able to bring 2 pieces of equipment on a hunt with you. Health Booster, meanwhile, is an item you plant down on the ground. For a certain amount of time it will blast out a healing aura that you and friends can stand in to heal. It goes without saying it doesn't heal the monsters, so don't worry about that. There are other boosters that will raise your affinity, cleanse status ailments, and so on. Mantles and boosters all work on a cooldown period. After they are finished, there'll be a cooldown before you can use them again. Remember, when your mantle expires, you have to take it off before the cooldown begins. If you are out of combat, the hunter will automatically remove it. Astera is your starting hub in Monster Hunter. There's a lot of useful things you can do here. First up, remember to frequently check the research Wyverian, the tiny little man, so you can upgrade and update your information on monsters. There's also the blacksmith where you can create weapons and armors. There's an item shop to buy and sell things. Then we have the farm, or the botanist. Here you can cultivate certain materials, such as insects, plants, and other materials you may need for crafting certain items. These will progress or grow between missions, and then you can harvest them whenever you see fit. There is a limit to how many can be in the box, however. You can also fertilize them and use boosters on them if you like. These will cost research points, which are the secondary currency in the game. There is money, which you can use for most things, and then also research points, which you will get for just, hunting, tracking, generally just playing the game. The Elder Melder, meanwhile, will allow you to meld certain items. Let's say you really need a Rathalos ruby. If you hand her in a special ticket that you might get from somewhere or other, you can get one for free. You will meld the ruby using the ticket. You can also meld many other items. My friend, for example, recently discovered he could meld his Steam tickets, which are an item you'll end up with hundreds of in Iceborne eventually from the Steamworks, and he could meld them for useful consumables. At the canteen, you can eat a meal to increase your stats as you head out on a hunt. Generally you want to eat before every hunt. As well as increasing your total health and stamina, meals can provide various buffs, the most useful of which is the aforementioned feline insurance. Basically gives you a free death or cart whilst hunting. And as mentioned, there's the research center, where you can regularly check the progress of your research on monsters that will increase as you hunt them, fight them, and pick up their tracks. At the resource center, meanwhile, you can pick up bounties. These will update every week, every day during special events, and task you with things you'll be doing anyway, like kill 5 large monsters, capture a flying wyvern. In addition, you can pick bounties aside from the weekly ones to perform as you just play the game. This is where you pick and hand in delivery bounties too. Finally, it is where you manage investigations, which are missions that typically reward more materials. They are repeatable missions. Let's say you need to farm a specific item from a monster, such as a Rathalos ruby. Well, you can take a Rathalos investigation, and then you'll have a higher chance than normal to obtain one. You'll get investigations just from fighting monsters, tracking them, and so on. Finally, there are various Easter eggs and other things like that in the hub, such as picking up the Poogie, the little pig, letting it sniff out treasure for you, and your own room that you can decorate and whatnot. But now, let's move on to the hunt. Most of your hunts will start with you finding the monster via tracking. If you go to the map and select a monster, your scoutflies will help lead you to it. You'll find monster tracks and other evidence of their presence in the maps, footprints, and the like. Pick these up to both increase your research on the monster, help your scoutflies track them, and finally get a chance to obtain an investigation mission for that monster. And very rarely a material just from picking up a track. Likewise, you want to make sure you are prepared. When you spawn in a camp, you'll see an item box. This will usually have a few free items in, such as potions, rations, and the like. In the tent at camps, you can replenish your stock of items, change loadouts and armor, and so on. If you're out of combat, you can instantly fly to any camp you have unlocked. If you are in combat, you will need to use the item Farcaster that will typically be able to return you to camp instantly, outside of a few special instances. When you begin fighting a monster, however, well, your strategy is up to you. My usual plan has a rough outline that stays the same with most monsters. A form of chaining crowd controls to enable higher damage. After all, it's a lot easier to hit something if it's on the ground having a seizure instead of zooming around in the air. Once you unlock the Clutch Claw in Iceborne, you can use that to grapple onto monsters and soften their parts. Heavy or great class weapons will soften with one grapple, whereas light weapons will require 2 grapple attacks to soften. However, they will also force the monster to drop slinger pods. Heavy weapons will also weaken for longer, I believe. But these slinger pods have a variety of uses and can be equipped into your slinger, along with certain other items such as flash pods. Flash pods will stun monsters and can be used to knock flying monsters out of the air. Dung pods will cause the monster to disengage and leave the area, useful if you want to force the monster to a different spot, a different part of the map, or get rid of an interloper. Screamer pods will force the monster Diablos to stop burrowing, and so on. If you grapple onto a monster, you can also punch it in the face to rotate it. This is usually combined with the flinch shot. Grappling and then hitting right trigger causes you to shoot all of your equipped slinger ammo. If you shoot it into the monster's head, it will send it stumbling forwards into a wall, off a ledge, for a high amount of damage, and knocking it down. You must flinch shot the head, apart from Rajang where you can't grapple his head, and the monster must run into a wall, or another monster, or off a ledge to be knocked down. This is often my first move in a hunt. Weaken the part of the monster I wish to break, and then flinch shot them, aka the wall bang. Most monsters are made up of certain parts that you can break or in some cases sever. Wings, tails, head, back, arm and so on. For one thing, breaking a monster's parts can increase the rewards you get. For another, it can decrease their effectiveness in combat. Breaking a Barioth's wings will reduce its mobility and cause it to stumble more often. Cutting off tails can mean their tail sweeps are easier to deal with. Softening up parts or weakening them with the clutch claw will help you break and sever, as well as just do more damage in general. Once the monster has been wallbanged, I move on to my next move in the crowd control chaining, a mount. When you do any aerial attack on a monster, such as jumping off a ledge, you'll build up a mount meter on a monster. When this meter is full, you will automatically begin a mounting attack on your next aerial attack. During this, you will be on top of the monster and stabbing away with your carving knife. You're also immune to most forms of damage. The monster will attempt to shake you off. You can resist this by either jumping to a different spot or bracing yourself with the right trigger, R2. If the monster runs into a wall, you'll have to jump to a different spot, as bracing will still knock you off. However, if that happens, you get one chance to grapple back on. Losing your stamina will also cause you to fall off, and you can't grapple back on in that case. Whilst you are immune to most attacks and most forms of damage whilst mounting, if you are poisoned or on fire, you will still take damage from that. Mounting is usually better to do in multiplayer hunts. 2. There are other ways to crowd control monsters. Putting down shock traps and pitfall traps, for example, having monsters walk into them, will render them defenseless for several moments. You cannot use traps on certain monsters, such as elder dragons. Also, when a monster has reached a critical health threshold, they can be captured in these traps. This health threshold ranges from 10% to 20% these days. How can you be sure you can trap a monster? When monsters reach critical health, they will begin limping back to their lair, to sleep. While sleeping, they will begin healing. Here, you can choose to wake them up with a powerful attack, such as the Great Sword's True Charge, or putting bombs on their face. Or the aforementioned wallbang into bombs. But yes, if you see a monster sleeping or limping, you can put it in a trap and then tranquilize it with trank bombs or trank ammo to capture it. It will take 2 trank bombs to knock out a monster. You can also prime them by hitting them with trank bombs and then putting them in a trap. That's often the better thing to do. And capturing is generally better than killing, as you get more rewards and, well, it ends the hunt faster. Elder dragons cannot be captured. You'll also notice that monsters will stagger or flinch now and then. When this happens, they will be defenseless for 4 seconds. If you grapple onto them during this period, it will extend that defenseless window for another 5 or 6 seconds. So even if you don't need to soften or flinch shot the monster, it's always worth grappling them during this window to extend the time the monster is vulnerable to your attacks, even if you just grapple and then immediately cancel the grapple. Additionally, monsters will be stunned or knocked out now and then, usually if you deal enough blunt damage to the head. There are other forms of crowd control too, such as monsters are walking into map hazards and the like. But these are the main forms of it you can rely on. So your checklist when fighting a monster is usually to break its parts as much as you can, whilst keeping it crowd controlled as much as you can, to restrict its movement and render it helpless whilst you pummel it. If you die in Monster Hunter, you'll be carted back to camp, where you can recoup. Most hunts allow for 3 carts, but this can vary from 1 to 5. 3 is just the standard. Of course, if you have feline insurance, that'll be bumped up to 4, as your first cart is free, so to speak. Aside from defeating the monster, you can return from hunts in 2 ways. One will allow you to keep everything you acquired during the hunt, whereas the other will lose everything you had during the hunt and set you back at the state you were before it started. For example, if you used 57 million potions and you have 1 cart left and the fight looks unwinnable, you might want to use the latter method to restore your items. During hunts, you'll also notice the world is full of items, bone piles, flowers, mining points, and so on. You can gather all of these items to craft certain things, such as potions and the like. When you're in a solo hunt, the monster will be fighting you and your palico alone, of course. You can pop an SOS at any time during a hunt, after you've seen cutscenes if it's a story mission. And this will allow up to 3 other players to join you. Alternatively, you can have players join you before the hunt even begins during the hub section. If you bring in 1 more hunter, you'll both have your palico and the monster's health will increase, as will its resistance to staggers, status ailments, and the like. If you have 3 hunters, the monster's stats will increase again and you won't have your palico. If you have 4 hunters, however, you won't see any more increase in the monster's stat than if there were 3 of you. Therefore, it is best to hunt with either 2 or 4 hunters in multiplayer. Also, when you're fighting with other hunters, you can heal them with the items Life Powder and Dust of Life. When it comes to Iceborne, you'll be getting hundreds and hundreds of Dust of Life from Steamworks, so don't be stingy with them. If you notice a hunter in trouble, throw out that powder. And remember, you can't really hurt other hunters, but you can flinch them by hitting them with your attacks. If you find yourself being continuously flinched and stunlocked by your fellow hunters, consider taking the skill Flinch Free, 1 level of which should be enough to render you immune to other hunters pummeling you. And finally, I've left the most important part for last. Set your custom messages in the game's options so you can delight and terrify random hunters you encounter on your journey. And that about covers it. I'll have another video in the near future covering the weapons in Monster Hunter. Much like this one, it will probably be 4 hours long. I'll be talking about their strengths and weaknesses and some of their strongest attacks, helping you decide which is right for you. Are you going to be a weapons guru who utilizes every weapon, depending on the circumstance? Or will you be like Doug, a master of 1 specific weapon that you clobber enemies with faithfully and exclusively? We'll find out. For now, thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, ask in the comments, and good luck out there, Sapphire Star.